Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Campfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. Victor's Children is a member of the Harbinger Media Network, which is a community working to support and promote left podcasts in Canada. Check out other shows like Tech Won't Save Us, Anti-Girl Boss Socialist Club, and Alberta Advantage. You can look at the show's list at harbingermedianetwork.com. This episode of Victor's Children is about anti-racism and socialism, and I'd like to start by thanking a listener, Fizz, for suggesting this topic. Racism is undeniably still a feature of capitalist society, even where formal legal equality and other anti-racist gains have been won. In the Canadian state, human rights laws make racial discrimination illegal, but racism persists. And it's not just about what Emma Dabiri, in her very good little book, What White People Can Do Next, calls, in her words, microaggressions and interpersonal slights, a focus on which, she says, often occurs at the expense of considering whiteness as a pervasive, insidious modus operandi. We see racism in the wage gap between white and non-white workers. We see it in the overrepresentation of people who experience racism in the worst jobs and the worst housing. We see it in policing, from killings to harassment. We see it in how, in other ways, the lives of non-white people are treated as less valuable than those of white people. Racism is not the actions of bad apples with bigoted ideas, and it's also more than ideology. It's a form of oppression that's part of how society is organized. It's a social relationship. In other words, in societies like so-called Canada, people recognized as white as a group dominate other groups whose members are treated as inherently and unchangeably different because of certain physical and or cultural features, supposedly. White people get certain advantages as a consequence of living in a racist society, even though most white people have very little power, since most white people are part of the working class. But those advantages are real, even though they're also poison bait for white workers, as we may discuss in this episode. And I'm very happy to have two guests joining me to discuss anti-racism from socialist perspectives today. So would you like to introduce yourselves?
I'm Teddy Zegeye-Gebrehiwot. I'm joining this call from Winnipeg, Treaty 1, and I'm a Black, Canadian, Ethiopian, Greek settler living here. I'm a socialist. I'm active with Solidarity Winnipeg. I'm also a parent, and that sort of puts some parameters on what I'm able to do time-wise. My day job is working in multimedia production with the University of Manitoba. So that's who I am, and thanks for having me here.
Hi, nice to meet you, Teddy. Thank you, David, for inviting me. I am Sharmeen Khan. I'm joining you in Toronto, which is Treaty 13, covered by the Mississaugas of New Credit and the Haudenosaunee and Wendat people. I'm identify as a socialist as well. I organized with a group known as Illegal Toronto. Most of my socialist activism has been around migrant justice and trying to sort of build a more class analysis or class struggle within migrant justice movements, and also bring a class analysis to how we understand the border and state. And then I also added a journal called Up in the Ante, which is more of a anarchist and socialist journal looking at revolutionary or radical organizing in North America. I also do a lot of trainings. So I think David invited me because he invited me to give a training to a climate justice group in Winnipeg a few years ago. And so I'm one of those facilitators that does like anti-racism, anti-oppression workshops. But I have been centering those on understanding racism through a capitalist and colonial lens. And really trying to fight the kind of equity, diversity kind of workshops that have become popular in the more liberal and capitalist spaces. So that's me.
Thank you both for joining me on this episode. And I'd like to start us off by talking about the politics of representation, because in so-called Canada today, liberal politics of representation, I think, are really influential in how people think about racism. The idea that what really matters is to get people in positions of power who reflect the population. So just to take an example from the present, it's really great that we have Anita Anand, who's a woman of color, as the Minister of National Defense for Canada. So do you have any thoughts about those kinds of politics today?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this has always been a hard issue for me because I don't know, sometimes I get very annoyed by the very simple tokenistic way representation works. But then I feel I'm constantly fighting for representation in like left spaces. So like my day job is I work at a union. I've been involved with the labor movement for over 10 years now. And it is really annoying to me how they talk about representation in a very tokenistic way, rather than like building real power with, many marginalized members in our union or in the labor movement overall. So on the one hand, I feel like liberalism and even conservative politics have offered this kind of like small flower to anti-racist movements, being like, hey, we'll make one of you in this position, either a CEO or a minister, but there'll be absolutely no structural changes. So it's then you have this scenario where you have anti-racist movements celebrating sometimes the elevation of a person of color into a position where they are killing people of color abroad. So, and then, you're kind of not supposed to complain about that because this is progress. It is really frustrating. And it kind of provides it's like a huge contradiction, I think, because I think for socialists, we're really trying to really elevate analysis about capitalism and exploitation. But we're in a liberal system that is telling us, be happy that a few of us are making it to the top and, maybe making more money and getting more power. And it's slow. We have to be patient. It's always this kind of balance of critiquing politics representation, but then also fighting for it, in established labor where they handpick leaders, like the majority of CUPE is are white folks, and the only people of color who get elected are the sort of designated equity group or equity positions. And it's bewildering when the majority of our membership are women and women of color. So, I have that kind of, I'll just leave it there because it is a really like tense position to be in. And it's always that kind of like I critique it, but I also fight for it. I don't know, Teddy, you go.
Yeah, that's a good way to phrase it, and that's a really good first question because it leads to having to ask all these other questions that are all connected. I like how you said that, Sharmeen, about like it's like the liberalism handing a flower to anti-racism movements, and it's like, and what is the nature of that flower? Is it like a cheap? Is it like a 7-Eleven flower or something? Is it like a can you sign my name on the card too kind of flower? Like it's just I love that, and I think it's a huge contradiction because like okay, even if you were to sort of take representation at you'd be most generous with looking at it, and you think okay, like which I'm not even condoning, but I'm just to show this idea here. So you say like, look, this person is in this position and that's great. That's progress. Now you have a person of color, you have a Black person in this particular role. And let's even move away from like, the Winnipeg example of having a Black police chief. Let's just move away from that. Let's look at something that's like less like inherently toxic. Let's just even look at like whether it's like a minister within the government. Okay, that's probably pretty toxic as well. Let's even look at it like an arts organization or something like that. Something that we can just say, okay, that's not going to inherently be something horrible just from the get-go. The person in a position like that are often faced with so many blocks, so many extra invisible labor they have to do, where they're not even able to. They confront again. They bump up against that sort of the power, the problem, the lack of actual, the sort of change that representation is supposed to be indicative of. And you see the limitations there in the best case scenarios. But then all the things that Sharmeen, which you raised, which is just like, like the contradiction of like, so you have someone within a toxic system or a toxic structure. Now you're in a position where you get to actually be in charge of the other police who are going to, harm people who experience racism already. Like, what's the progress there? I think the thing that is always worth mentioning, and you also mentioned this too, Sharmeen, is that, from like what is important about representation in the first place is that if a population has diversities of all kinds, all sorts of ways of having diversity in it, and since we're focusing on racism, we're going to talk about racial diversity. If there isn't already like representation in upper power structure, upper positions that reflect that population, the diversity of that population, that means, just like the logic of that means, there's actually effort or force or some sort of thing that is making it not diverse. It's actually preventing it from being diverse. There's actually an obstacle in place that's messing with the natural entropy of things, which are just random diversity below, random diversity above. It should equal that way. And if it doesn't end up that way, if there is exclusively white men or white people in general in positions of power, and that's not what the society is, then that means that there's actual active forces that are preventing the natural, osmosis of the people in those positions to represent people more generally in society. So that is a problem. That's obviously a problem, but it's, as Sharmeen's pointing out, it's a symptom. It's a symptom of how the society is. So, the cheap flower that is dealing with the symptom, and as I pointed out, not even really dealing with it, just like papering over, just like a cheap way of dealing with it, doesn't get to the root, and doesn't get into the real problem that causes that imbalance. But at the same time, I mean, when I think about, what kind of movies do I like to watch? What kind of media do I want to consume? What kind of things do I want my family and my child to see? Obviously, like what I want is something that isn't like white, nonstop white. I want to have the world sort of be reflected, even in superficial ways, to be able to see herself, for us to see ourselves, because that does matter. So at the heart of it, representation matters, but if you understand why there isn't representation and what it would take to change it, you can see that just having people in these positions is not even close to enough.
Then maybe the next thing that I'd like to bring into the conversation is multiculturalism, which within so-called Canada is, a pretty prominent thing, shaping through state policies and practices the ways that racism happens, and also the way that efforts to combat it happen. Himani Bannerji, in her book, The Dark Side of the Nation, has said that among people who experience racism, multiculturalism as a form of bounty or state patronage is a managed version of our anti-racist politics. So could you share some thoughts about that?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at this one. And yeah, I really appreciate, that book has been so formative to my understanding and my anti-racism. I wish more people, especially in the States, I wish people in the States read Himani Bannerji, because she has really answered some of these like lingering debates and questions around, representation, diversity, identity politics, that seems to has kind of been taken up in the last few years with some weird leftist hot takes. But I think the role of multiculturalism as a way to manage radical anti-racist and like socialist movements is, the best way to describe it. And it's a way to manage people's expectations, especially if you've been, told your whole life that, this is only what you deserve as a wage, or this is only what you can do as a job. But you're contributing to this kind of like overall, framework of multiculturalism. It really keeps people in their place. But I think the most insidious part of multiculturalism is it is a huge, I don't know what word to use, but a way to really divide, I would say, like Black and people of color and Indigenous communities, because I feel it sets people up as a way to be like, look, you have these opportunities that are much better and greater than Indigenous communities. And I mean, how I experienced it with my parents being immigrants was that, okay, we're not like them. Like we moved to Regina, which is for me, ground zero, settler colonialism, close to Winnipeg. And the whole narrative was like, we have these opportunities given by the Canadian state, and at least we're not like the Indigenous people who live in North Regina, you know? We're not like those natives who are like, you know, struggling, homeless, etc. And it really, really put a fissure in building any relationships, any solidarity with those communities and the surrounding nations that we settled on. And it was like from the very beginning of settling there, like you're going to be part of this multicultural fabric, but you know, who was left out from that narrative was any relationship around settler colonialism or colonialism at all, and how we were benefiting from, you know, getting cheap rent for housing and being able to settle easily on the backs of Indigenous people there. And so it's very insidious because it's like a source of pride, you know, like we had Mosaic where we celebrate different cultures and it's supposed to be a worthy thing to celebrate. And, you know, people say like we go to other countries and we just don't have this kind of diversity and multiculturalism, so we can be this model in the world. And, you know, no one wants to take those nice feelings away. But for me, like, just like as I became more radical and started doing solidarity work with Indigenous communities, at first I was like, oh, well, my parents are colonized and there's colonialism here, so there should be like a direct like relationship, like we should get along. And it's not until I realized how you know, the state used my family and used settlement as a way to be a form of backlash against Indigenous solidarity, that I realized that actually no, these are very different relationships happening through the lens of multiculturalism. So yeah, that's kind of my main way that I like deconstructed it and rejected multiculturalism. And yeah, I totally agree that it is a way to manage labor, manage new immigrants or arrivants to this country. So yeah, I'll just hand it over to Teddy.
Yeah, that's really, really, yeah, well said and interesting. And I'm going to say, I agree with all that. I'm going to just say some things that are not repeating that, which are two things that this question made me think about. And I don't even know if I have it fully figured out. So maybe this is a chance for some cross discussion. But one of them is that, okay, wait, just a side note. I just think, first of all, like the word multicultural is very interesting because, I mean, I'm not sure of any culture that exists with zero connection or influence of other cultures. Like this whole idea of like humanity in these sort of anthropological silos, and obviously multiculturalism means something very different in this state. But just like, I just think sometimes the word is a little bit interesting. But the two things I think, like particularly like, you know, scratching from a socialist perspective that doesn't overlap with what you just said, Sharmeen, because all the things you said I would be the first things I would say. But the other thing I'm wondering is, you know, in a capitalist structured society, so many things that the functions of society are mediated through businesses. Like if you think about, you know, obviously you could think about things like public libraries and public leisure centers and schools and stuff like that, which, you know, are from the state, but you know, you go to a cafe or you go to a restaurant or you're in a like you're going to these sort of different things that you access in your life and that make up big parts of how you access life are through businesses. So I think like when I think of multiculturalism in Winnipeg here, and just in general, like I think a lot of it is definitely within the umbrella of a capitalist idea of now you can have like sort of culturally identified businesses. Like now multiculturalism means that you have like you know, like an Ethiopian auto mechanic shop, and you have like a Nigerian grocery store, and you have like and then of course all these things can spill over into like cultural events, and you can have like a day for this group or that group or this continent or that continent. But I just think the way that is sort of on the back of a sort of business centric idea. There's an ethnic yellow pages, and look how thick it is because we're so multicultural. So there's something very like not questioning culture and business as a sort of what are the agents, what are the actual pieces of cultural unit, and it comes down to like, yes, it's a business. That's what freedom means, like in a multiculturally successful society. It means that you can set up a Chinese grocery store and our society is not going to avoid it because we have space for multiculturalism. That I think there's a piece of that. I know I'm being very reductive, but I just think that is sort of very at odds with the socialist idea of what kind of vision of society we have, what we do with blending and preserving cultures, and then to bring it back to settler colonialism. Again, like you're seeing like this sort of like this. I'm noticing a lot again in the same vein. Like these are indigenous owned businesses, these are indigenous owned services, and so what it means to combat settler colonialism and to be anti-racist in that direction is to again go through this business view. And I just think it really constrains what the idea of liberation is. So there's that idea that I was like, I never thought of it that way, but it just sort of started to become more clear. And the other one that I was just wondering was like, is it even possible to really have an internationalist view and have a multiculturalist view, multiculturalism at the same time? Like, are they actually counterposed to each other? Because what does it mean to be able to, succeed even in the liberal sense of a multiculturalism within the bounds of a domestic state? And then how does that relate to global directions of movement of capital? And that seems very asymmetrical. That seems very not multicultural. So it just seems like that, even if you take multiculturalism as far as it can go, there's a really hard wall, and that wall is, the wall of imperialism. So I wonder what we think about that, or it's just a question I had. And yeah.
Can I just respond to that quickly? Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. Is I would say that multiculturalism is kind of like just counter opposed to like what I understand is like socialist ideas of internationalism, and I'm really glad that you articulated the confines of business and capitalism, because I guess it's like it operates in an idea of like white supremacy, so we can accept white people owning like major like Rogers and Bell and Telus and all this stuff, but we have room for like a Chinese restaurant, Vietnamese restaurant, Indian clothing stores that kind of provide. So multiculturalism becomes this like consumerist fetishism, for everyone. It's like enjoyment, it's pleasure, but should there be any, uprisings of any kind? And it's like, I feel it's the same narrative with indigenous communities too, right? Where, a lot of settlers are like fine with like indigenous people selling their art and owning, selling their, their crafts at a store. But it becomes a little inconvenient when they start talking about land back, and occupying things so that pipelines can't go through. That's when multiculturalism is like is a little uncomfortable. So I think it's really interesting to see it play out like in a very consumeristic way, and also kind of marketed. It's like a huge marketing ploy. I think internationally it's used that way. I think even when Canada is involved with imperialist wars, it often holds up like, no, we're multicultural. We love, when the Syrian war was happening and Trudeau tweeted, even though his policy was counter to that tweet that all, refugees are welcome in Canada, which is a lie. It is a huge brand for Canada. And it is really insidious. Any traveling you do, people are just like, oh yeah, Canada, it's so multicultural. And I feel it really runs counter to it's a really seductive form of nationalism that people hold on to. It differentiates us from the United States and England. I think it's really hard to unpack that for people. And that's why in my workshops, when I do these workshops, for different workplaces and unions, Canada as a multicultural state is really important for people's identity. It's really hard for them to let go. And they just think I'm just like this, negative, negative Nancy or whatever. And they really hold on to it closely. They'll talk, they can accept police violence and, all that stuff. But when it comes to multiculturalism, they're like, but I don't want to live in a country that's not multicultural. So yeah, it's really, really seductive and a really, probably a really smart form of nation building. Whoever came up with that, I would say Pierre Trudeau, maybe. So kudos to him.
Yeah, I want to jump in and just say, and what I think is also really noticeable right now is that as capitalism is failing to even give people, is failing even more and more, and accelerating in its failure to give white people the sense that they have a bright future to look forward towards, and the privileges that they were able to have before, and people in general, just like the stability of life. And as that is declining, you can see even the inadequacy of multiculturalism to resist the growing fascist and hard right kind of appeals to the better time of before, and the scapegoating of how multicultural. So then you have this right wing kind of pushback against multiculturalism, which was sort of built into the weakness of multiculturalism in the first place, because it very much is superficial. And I just, when I said before, I don't know if it'll get edited out, but what I said before about the word multiculturalism and how it's this funny idea of, I don't know, cultural siloing. And I think cultural exchange, if you leave what multiculturalism is and you just think of the idea of people sharing, that's amazing. It's what would actually be multiculturalism is incredible. But multiculturalism, TM multiculturalism, a trademark or whatever, is totally not that. And now we see what the erosion of that means. So it's kind of how socialists shouldn't put a lot of, in my opinion, confidence in something so liberal and so easy to maintain a very, very unfair arrangement of society. And as we see right now, it's not protecting us, it's not saving us, it's not making the PPC lose seats. It's they don't have seats, but lose support. It's just inadequate, totally inadequate. So yeah.
Okay, then I think we've been talking about a number of responses to racism which are pretty inadequate, and the philosopher Ilyas Srinivasan has argued that anti-racism, like feminism, can and often does come in a form that's congenial to capitalism. And then in response to this, you get some socialists who respond by dismissing anti-racism and other challenges to particular forms of oppression, and then saying what's needed is politics that will unite the working class against the so-called real problem, whether that's neoliberalism or capitalism. And I think we've been hearing some more of that kind of politics, especially coming out of parts of the US left in recent years. But more often, I think, certainly in so-called Canada, the response isn't to simply dismiss the fight against racism. It's to say, well, we need socialist politics that oppose all forms of oppression. And to be clear, there's nothing to disagree with about that. But then it goes on to say, well, we need a united working class struggle as a way to fight against that oppression. And people will argue, for example, well, if we raise the minimum wage and we have better employment standards and we have pharmacare, that will especially help workers who experience racism. And that's true. These kind of reforms would do that. And this is much better than simply dismissing anti-racism as so-called rad lib. There's no doubt about that. And it's clear, yes, socialists do need to be trying to foster a united working class struggle against oppression. So, for example, multiracial struggle against racism. But I think it's still the case that socialists too often fail to grasp a couple of things that really matter here. One is that we need demands that do challenge specific forms of oppression, whether that be something like status for all or serious employment equity measures. And another is that autonomous organizing by oppressed people, so people who experience racism, for example, or trans people or queer people, whoever it might be, this is actually a part of how to build solidarity and how to build equality, which are things that we need to get to a working class struggle which is united in a deeper way than agreeing to, say, raise the minimum wage. And I'm not dissing campaigns to raise the minimum wage at all, far from it, but to suggest that we need to go beyond those kinds of demands if we're going to build the kinds of struggles that we need. So I guess to circle back to the question I want to ask, connecting to what Srinivasan talks about, what do you think about how socialists should respond to forms of anti-racism that are congenial to capitalism?
Okay, so I think I can think of there's two things at the same time I want to say, but the one is that I don't think the things like raising minimum wage and stuff are congenial to capitalism necessarily. Obviously it's not calling for an overthrow of capitalism, but I do think it's in opposition to capitalism, capitalists' preference, I suppose, unless it's going to be the preference of, do this reform so you can maintain how things are. But I think that just the examples before about the necessity of having more of a specific, that puts anti-racist demands more as the focus than something that is broader that also will have the consequence of pushing back against racism. I think that how I see it is that the logic behind saying try to go for more universal demands that don't put racism front and center is to put your chips in the we're stronger united approach. So let's look for a demand that's more universal, and and good that it will actually push back against racism, but it also is not focusing on racism. And the reason it's choosing that approach is because if you have more people, then it's going to be more powerful, and that's the way to take that route. Versus saying well, if you did go, the implication or maybe the idea, the comparison would be saying let's look at something that's specifically tackling racism, so an anti-racist demand explicitly, which by its definition of who it's focusing on as benefiting from winning that demand is not going to be as broad. And the concern, I suppose, if someone was in a position to choose one over the other, would be to say that, well, this has less of a chance of succeeding, perhaps because it's not as broad or something like that. I don't know. I think that sometimes these questions are a little bit more disconnected from what decision making is happening when you're trying to formulate demands. I think it's easy to frame in this way when we're not thinking about a particular union or a particular campaign or something like that. So that's the first thing I want to say. But the other thing I want to say is that I think it's maybe a false fear to say that you have to have a broad demand rather than a specific demand, a demand that appeals to the broad interests versus the specific interests of a small group. And I think that's not really, I think we should question that because, and I think we should question why it's not possible in that formulation to have broad support for a demand for specific people. Is it the case that you can't have a whole union membership support demands that are specifically anti-racist? Is that assumption really the right starting point? And if it is, is it not possible to shift that view? I guess kind of rambling here, but I just think in these sorts of things, what you're really doing is you're you're building capacity by doing. It's not like it will be wasted. If you really wage an anti-racism campaign that does have like a smaller group of a whole that is the beneficiary of that, it's not a waste to the whole if you actually build up that like ability to have that solidarity and also to win demands like that. It's actually like very strengthening in my view, because first of all, like it breaks the idea of atomization. Like if it's not in there for me, then there's no value. That's a good thing to break at all points, because that's exactly how you'll be divided when it comes to waging campaigns against an employer, against a state, etc. So you build a capacity to break that divide and conquer kind of approach, but also like you break the sort of like way we've been socialized to just think of everyone as individuals and atomize. But also like the idea of saying like, well, people need like, there's what am I trying to say? But also the idea of taking a very principled stance and having your reason as because this is what is right, and just having like a sort of like strong ethical and principled stance is to your strength, if that actually is a motivator. Because I don't think that the kind of change we're going to need is going to just follow the route of the most convenient. Like I think like it's this things are going to be uphill battles in all kinds of ways, and the common denominator between those things is like you're doing it because you want to win, and you're doing it because it's right. It's not just because it's convenient, and that's that. So, and you don't know if you're going to win without trying. So if you don't have that strong principled like force behind you, then you're gonna neglect all kinds of opportunities. You're gonna write them off before you even try. So I just don't think it's like I think the way that the counterposing those two approaches is framing one as a waste in some way. And I just think like, and not by you, but I just think like that kind of way of thinking about it is just framing one as a waste. And it's forgetting that that kind of work is like, well, you know, you really are trying to, what's the metaphor? Like build the plane as you're falling or whatever. It's like, it's none of it is, that's not a waste if you're actually like getting stronger. But don't take these words as a justification for going into pointless battles where you think you're never going to win. I'm not saying that. I just, yeah. So I'm going to end it right there, because I'm sure Sharmeen has more clear and better things to say than that. That's what I think.
No, that was no, those are really important interventions. And yeah, just to like, I agree that there is this weird backlash around I'll just say like the more identity politics realm of things and organizing, kind of like we're being blamed that there's no working class unity because we talk about racism. So that's somehow people of color's fault or feminists' fault, you know, that there's no working class unity because we keep talking about racism, and that how is somehow division. I always find that when people are like, you know, let's not talk about these, you know, specific cases as if it involves a small amount of people, and talk about campaigns about unity. I always find that those, you know, campaigns around general unity are still based on like a white supremacist politics, you know, or have this kind of like ignorance around the specific experiences that people of color or women or queer people might experience. You know, for example, when unions say, we fought for you to have the 5-day work week, we fought for you to have the weekend. I mean, it's just so ignorant to the realities of so many people working 2 to 3, 4 jobs all through the weekend, all through the evenings, you know, predominantly, you know, in communities of color, they're doing service work, delivery work. It's so ignorant to like women and how, and like in social reproduction, you know, and that was the same case with like when liberal feminists came out with like, oh, well, you know, women don't be homemakers. They also want to work. Well, actually, Black women have been working as well as being a homemaker, you know? So, yeah, I just feel like, it's really offensive to and I've been constantly told this by socialists and different union activists that to bring up anti-racism or feminism divides the working class as if it's not divided already, and blame these communities for that. And for me, I'm wondering, like, why doesn't it build unity to specifically lift up communities of color or women in leadership, building power, building leadership amongst that? Why doesn't that seen as unifying the working class as a whole rather than dividing? And for me, it's because I feel that still on the left, and even the radical left, there is some fear of women or women of color or people of color holding leadership positions, and taking leadership away from predominantly white people. I just like, I don't know if it's not a conspiracy. I just feel like there are some people on the left who just cannot, who have fear about that, and that all the issues then will be around, oh, those annoying people of color and they're like suffering, and yeah, and it's just weird. Like, when conservative governments are won, it seems that like anti-racist movements are to blame. It's like, oh well, conservative governments are winning because you keep going on about defunding the police, and people, that's really dividing the working class around that. And so, yeah, it's really, it's offensive to me to be told that, but I also am there to talk about strategy and tactics. I am there to, talk about how we can frame things. But it's always this idea that white working class people, if they see people of color in leadership roles, they'll walk away. Rather than like, actually, maybe they'll join, more. Or this idea that white working class people will feel threatened that you're trying to take away some of their things, their rights. Rather than maybe a lot of white working class people are angry about, this huge, delineation between wages and working conditions and living conditions between their own neighbors. So yeah, I feel like there's a lot of assumptions being made that really kind of gloss over or try to hide, some like real racism in the left, and some of those assumptions come out with that. So, and to go to the original question about like, do I support things that are congenial to capitalism? It really depends on. For me, it's tactics. Like, would I ever support, like the position of, like a police chief or a minister to be a person of color? No, because I don't feel like it does little to lift up communities of color. It doesn't build leadership amongst the working class. But I think that campaigns around, raising the minimum wage, not only will it provide, real material improvements to people's lives, but I feel like you can pull out experiences of who are making the minimum wage, right? Which is mostly communities of color. If they're making that, sometimes they make lower if you're a migrant, and so I think it's important to lift those up. But yeah, for me to decide what socialists should decide on should be around like, what builds leadership, what builds power, and definitely get behind that. Yeah, for me, I think like we have some socialists here in Toronto who would be like, why $20 an hour? We should be demanding $100 an hour, and I'm just trying to just be like, okay, that's totally true. But, or we should be building like working power through unions and not just like, appeal to reforms. But the reality is these campaigns do really build leadership in different communities that we haven't seen before, at least here in Toronto that I'm seeing, So for me, it's around tactics and how to build power so that we can, up the ante and, build more successful campaigns on top of that, and just bring people into the room, because like so far, and David, I know you've written about this so much, but like, when you look at union leadership, there is a problem of whiteness in the entire labor movement, and like even just recently, one of the largest QP locals in Canada, QP 79, two white male people in leadership are now getting in trouble for like, extorting money and all this stuff. And for for people of color who are left out of those leadership positions, it's like, I don't know, it's just like really annoying to see how these positions are just held with this like white man's club where they like just trying to benefit themselves financially when we can make our union more democratic, more, full of activism, full of inclusion. Yet we're stuck in these, like really like I feel old fashioned models that don't represent the real working class. So yeah, that's my rant about, that.
I want to jump in one more time and maybe not one more time, but uh, just, yeah, like thanks for all that, Sharmeen. And also, like when you were talking a lot about the blame, like the different kinds of blames for why there's a weakness, why there's an inadequacy, why there isn't enough power, blames basically like scapegoating talk of oppression as the reason why there isn't class power. I mean, I'm not trying to reduce what you're saying, but there's a lot of that theme going on there. And I think that also points to a kind of a question about like exactly everything you said, like how are we thinking about building power, and like does this lead to that or does it not lead to that? And so when there's the blame, against raising up the reality of oppression and the need to fight back against it, it's totally like it's unfair, but it's also like really inadequate as an explanation for what needs to be changed to get the results we want in the first place too. And I was wondering, like, okay, because before you mentioned like doing workshops that challenge the equity, diversity, inclusion approach, I was wondering, like, I'm curious for personal reasons as well about that, because I'm very frustrated in my workplace about how that is so heavily emphasized as the way to respond to things. And I just feel like probably a lot of people, like, I mean, obviously on the surface, like socialists could just be like, yeah, that's, it's a employer approach to anti-racism and it doesn't do much. But I don't know, just because you were already mentioning that you do workshops and stuff like that, and that are counterposed to that. If you want, I'm very curious to hear if you have anything you want to connect to that. But no pressure. It's your call.
Yeah, is that okay, David? Should me to respond to that? Yeah, it is like an awkward position. Like, for example, I got a few years ago, one of the police divisions in Toronto asked me to give them an anti-oppression workshop, and I had to tell them that, like, well, I mean, I'm gonna like charge you like $100,000, and at the end of the workshop, I'll be asking the police to burn their uniforms and quit their jobs. So I don't think we're a good fit. Yeah, but there is now, actually, and a lot of activists I've worked and organized with are now moving into the EDI stuff because it's a lot of money, especially, like a lot of companies will pay you actually $100,000 just to have a woman of color come up and basically say, don't say racist things at work. um, and they love that. They love having a woman of color do that, and be really nice about it. Um, and so, yeah, the turn to EDI, which I think has really exploded actually since the killing of Floyd last year or 2 years ago, and then the rise of BLM. I think there's been a huge. I mean, the reckoning around racism and white supremacy is like, I'm not saying it's not a bad thing. Like, it's needed and has strengthened anti-racist movements for sure. And we're like even just talking about police violence is at a level which I don't think I had before that. Like, we're talking about racism in ways that is refreshing to me as further along, but it has generated a lot of corporations, capitalists, businesses to think about racism under that is congenial to capitalism. So they'll be thinking like, oh, we only have like a bunch of white workers. Why is that? Or we only have specific rules. And so they'll bring in these facilitators to give advice or to have people's race consciousness to a limit. And it's really only based on interactions. and then some hiring, for sure, like having an EDI lens when you're hiring, and like things to avoid in your job description so that people of color will feel more, excited about to apply, which I think also like reproduces some racism. Like some advice I got was like, or that some people give is like, don't demand post-secondary education because some people of color might feel intimidated to apply because a lot of people of color don't have post-secondary education. I just feel that's a little weird. Like, I mean, I think there's different ways you could like reach out to communities of color and not just assume that like they're all not going to university. Anyway, but I feel it reproduces a lot of assumptions of like people of color are weak, we need to be coddled, we need to be carried gently into these workplaces because we're not used to more professional, we're coming from the factories into like a corporation and we don't know, like office culture. It's just like really weird bullshit, honestly. So yeah, and obviously the workshops I do, I centralize capitalism. And so I actually have done anti-oppression workshops for businesses, and I'm like, yes, the reason you're having these issues is because there isn't actually any worker power in your organization to like collectively bargain for like anti-racist hiring or feminist hiring. So for workers here, you might want to think about that.
Did you get invited back?
Yeah, not often. And like, and or like the wage relationship creates this. If you have a business and you need to make a profit, you have a relationship of exploitation. If you don't want that, if you feel bad about that, you could become a co-op. You could talk about unionization, like but a lot of people just want to be told not to be racist, and talk about like unknown biases and things like that, which is, I mean, obviously I don't want anyone in any workplace to experience racism and like have that chilly climate. So I'm like totally fine doing that. But I'm also just, it's just very limiting, right? Because, okay, so someone doesn't call me a packy at work, I still make $10 less an hour than them, okay, my feelings won't be hurt, but I'm still unable to reproduce myself. I'm still struggling to make rent. I'm still in poverty. And so, yeah, that's so mostly I mostly do workshops are mostly for activists, but because of now the popularity of anti-oppression, people ask me for some. I often don't get invited or say no, to those things, but I have done a few, and I sometimes get invited back. There are some, like more liberal businesses that really want to like contend with like exploitation and not be that. So that's fine. But it's, but yeah, it's for me, it's almost a betrayal, this emergence of EDI and people and friends I know engaged in it. I know it's just like for them, yeah, they want to take money from white folks, but I want to like recruit people. I want to recruit people into movements. If white folks are really angry, I'm like, great, then join Surge, join, OCAP, I'm from Toronto, or get involved in a union. Like, I want them to be angry. I don't want them to be like, oh yeah, well, I never said the N word, so I'm good, and that's it. So my goal has always been, I want to bring people into the movement and radicalize them, and or just not radicalize them, but like see the solution through organizing, not just like policing their own behaviors. So that's my long rant about that.
Well, I think that connects very nicely to the next issue that I was hoping to bring into the conversation, which is, I mean, in general, what white people should do to fight racism, because there's been a lot more talk about this in the last number of years, probably I think more than ever. So many books about it, so many educational activities, so many posts on social industry, and so on. And I think we probably all agree that from an anti-racist socialist perspective, there is some value in this, but there's also a lot missing. And there's in the mix some ideas that are very unhelpful. And I think I'd like to just bring up the question of allyship because of this. And in the book that I mentioned earlier, Emma Dabiri claims that, in her words, allyship appeals to a desire to help a victim. But then she says coalition is about mutuality. It reframes the task as identifying common ground, while attending to the specificities of racism that all can strive for and that all will benefit from. Although maybe I would add, maybe not all benefit from the kind of coalition that she's talking about. So What do you think about allyship and about what Dabiri is arguing in terms of coalition as an alternative to allyship?
I'm just going to connect, I think, connected a little bit to the last conversation. And the first thing I want to just say is that I appreciate that you when you framed the question, David, you sort of described what the idea behind it is, because I do notice that, at least in my experience of EDI workshops and stuff like that, there is a lot of emphasis on labels, as if like getting the right labels and that kind of thing. And labels change, and what one person means by allyship and coalition isn't the same as another person, and sometimes even the same person will use it in different ways over time, and that's just how things go, like that's not super unique to this. So I think the idea behind allyship in the way you described it, which is away from a charity mentality, allyship in the way you described it is as a charity mentality, and that being a problem, and coalition being away from a charity mentality and solidaristically finding common ground and doing things together to change things as a whole. I think that's, I can't think of a way that would be the wrong way. I think that's correct. But I do think that it's sometimes it's a bit a situation of having all these intentions and nowhere to go, sort of a thing, like people might be ready to go, they might want to change things, they might understand the distinction that's described, but then when trying to put it into practice, when trying to think of, well, okay, what are the next steps for coalition building, or what are the ways to actually put these ideas into the here and now in my workplace, in my community, etc. Lots of questions arises. I think in those cases, it's very useful to have other people you can talk to about it, to have organizations you can try to wrestle these questions together. I think the label point is key. One thing I wanted to just say about the white question, about what white socialists in particular responsibilities when it comes to fighting racism, I do think that it's I was thinking about this before, and people talk about it a lot. Not a new point, but it has to be said. Like, you got to figure out your own discomfort. That really gets in the way in insidious ways, and I feel like some particular examples I want to talk about here, because obviously socialists who are listening to this are probably not. They're probably on board with all of this. So, if you're a white person and you're listening to this, you're probably, I'm opposed to racism. I want to be better as a socialist in fighting racism. And I'm, they might be a white person and thinking these things. So they're already coming from a good on-side position. But I do notice that when I'm working with people, when I'm working with white people or involved interacting, I notice little things that I interpret as discomfort that make me feel a little bit slow to proceed. And a lot of it has to do with wishy-washy language and feeling uncomfortable being direct and directly talking about racial issues, even saying words like Black or South Asian or Indigenous or other racial categories, or using a lot of euphemisms, meandering sentences. And I know through this whole podcast, I've been doing nothing but meandering sentences, but when it's a pattern talking about racism and the meandering sentences show up, I feel like, it might be tough to have a candid conversation about racism or issues like this, because this person they've changed. They've become super uncomfortable. They've become super unstable. There's something that they're still working out on their own end. And now, what's my interaction in this situation? Am I going to have to manage that while I'm also trying to talk about something? So then you won't even see, if you're working with a person like me, you won't even see the withdrawal on my part. But it's a noticing of the discomfort. And why? It's because it's not really productive to talk with people who haven't worked those things out. I haven't been encouraged to continue it, because I don't, there's a bigger purpose than making someone feel bad or managing their feelings. So it really turns me off when white people interact in that way. And I personally prefer like very direct statements. And I'm not talking about direct to me, just describing a scenario, just saying like this happened and that was racist or something like that, versus, euphemism upon euphemism. And especially when, so yeah, like, I mean, what's my point here? There's a whole probably listicle upon listicle. Actually, I should give more credit than that. There's a lot of people who wrote about what white people can do about how to work in anti-racist ways. But I just really want to emphasize the like working through one's own discomfort, because it really is a hindrance. And unfortunately, really, really unfortunately, I know a lot of white people are anti-racist organizing anti-racist groups. At the level of collective anti-racist organizing is it's beautifully resurging in a lot of ways, but I know a lot of people just don't have a lot of experience in that, so they're starting from a really low point, and that's a bit of a challenge. That's what I'm going to say for that. My first thing.
Yeah, so much to chew on there. I just want to respond to the last point about the discomfort of white folks, because there's especially with like the emergence of EDI and like so many books about how to be an ally in the list, there's a lot of confusing messages. Like, so one is like taking direction from people of color, and what does that mean? Listen to them. The list I have seen has been like, never disagree with a person of color, and what I'm finding now is like this kind of like ally performativity that won't engage in the fight, like the debates about tactics and struggles, in fear of being called racist or, whatever, oppressive or whatever. Like one last example was around the convoy in Ottawa. There was a big meeting and around like we need to mobilize and have a counter protest. And I guess there was a few people of color said who talked about like this is unsafe for us, like we are being harassed, and so any counter protest will like put a target on us. Really fair point, but that meant so many of the white folks in the room just kind of like held back and like, okay, we can't have a counter protest because we don't want to be racist. And I'm like, this is political struggle. Like, let's have the fight, and kind of like what I tell folks also, like, I'm not excluded from this. I've also been accused of different forms of repression, is that we need to see those as invitations, of like challenging our behavior. Why does it make us uncomfortable? We live in a racist society. Of course, we're going to have these dynamics in a meeting, so when people accuse each other of racism, rather than people being like, oh, I don't want to be that, so I'm just going to acquiesce and agree, have the fight, have the fight. And like, I feel like anti-racism or kind of allyship has become this like very like waspy, liberal, be nice to each other, and has taken conflict totally out of our struggle, and so, and this is new for me. I feel like we had fights in the 90s when maybe there was more mobilization around things like in the 2000s. But I find now that, people I consider whatever allies or comrades are really scared to have the fight, and so, and the worst thing, if I were to have a stupid list of how to be an ally, it's like, be radically honest. I don't need to be organizing with white people who are dishonest with me or have an idea they're too scared to bring to a meeting. If we're in the meeting together, let's hash it out. Let's have the fight. And so, people, again, to go back to those workshops on High Forward, love the list. They love to like check off, yes, I listen. Okay, I'll read bell hooks. I'm going to like speak up at dinner table. My uncle says something racist, and as if anti-racism is a checklist that we need to like tick off to, to win the struggle. And so I've stopped doing it, like, or I really try and pack this idea that like, no, we don't need allies. Like, an ally kind of assumes this a broken relationship. And it also, to me, it means this like kind of fetishization of the of anti-racist movements, where you're so disconnected from it, but you want to get in. Okay, I invite anyone who's like if they didn't think about it and now they want to act, is to start building those relationships, and for me it's like start going to those meetings, start connecting with those organizations, at least just start showing up to like events and protests and building those relationships. And for me, an ally is kind of like the simple way out if you don't want to do any organizing, if you don't want to build any relationships. So you can still continue living your, bubble of, disconnected from different movements and so individual as well. There's no like collective organizing and how to be an ally. There's no like have a reading group with militants and, at least read like the basics. Like it's always about watching your behavior and doing the small things. And what's interesting about the ally talk too is they talk about it as correcting imbalances. Like we have this like perfectly functioning system, but there's just a few quirks that if you could just manage your behavior correctly, will balance things out. And being an ally is going to do nothing for the injustice and the oppression that happens. So yeah, I do really reject those politics about being an ally, but I understand it, and I really would try to like connect it more to building relationships and struggle that are happening. But yeah, it has really kind of given this like narrative that just about like be nice, like just like this kind of like very like non-conflict thing. And for certain circles that might, like for liberals that might be good, but I think for socialists, like we need to have more fights, and like we need to define, okay, for anti-racism, what does that mean in our everyday organizing, and have those fights. I'm not saying that like for sure I've called out white people when I'm like, I feel like you're not listening to me, and I feel like some of your the culture of whiteness is like really coming out. They can disagree with me, and like I can take it. I mean, I'm just like kind of tired of these narratives being like people of color, black folks, and just folks are just like so traumatized by white supremacy, which we are, but that we just can't take any argument, any disagreement, or that we'll just like walk away. So I feel there's still like a huge, and for me that's around a lack of relationship and a lack of trust. So I would forefront those as like things that if you want to be an ally to do, rather than just like fight with your uncle at Thanksgiving.
Yeah, and I think that another piece of the puzzle, as I see it, is that there's sometimes, or I guess often, this assumption that essentially that there's nothing that white workers have to fight for in this, and so the connection between common class interests and anti-racism is just out of the frame. And sometimes even I've seen people who are pretty radical in terms of, or really serious and committed about their anti-racism, end up kind of approaching it that way, which is a very strange way to try to engage white working class people in taking up this issue.
If I could just, one small point about that, David, is it is a very strange way, but I always think that like if for any campaign that if you don't see white people, any gains for like indigenous people, black people, people of color will benefit white working class people as well. Like it's, just because it's, see yourself in those campaigns, any win for any worker will be good for all working class people. And so, it's a very unusual analysis to think about division that way. But anyway, I just wanted to throw that out.
Teddy, did you have anything you wanted to add to this?
Yeah, I just I would recommend people read the short article in the first Spectre journal, Marxism and White Privilege, building on Du Bois by Vanessa Wills, because I can't find it. I'm trying to find, but there's just a great analogy about it's necessary to a socialist to think through the question of like how to build solidarity in spite of and in opposition to the differential privileges that people have, while simultaneously wanting to build a different system. And that's a real question. And you're worse off in all the efforts that you have by not confronting that question, not thinking it through. And you're better off for having good answers to it and good practices. There's a really great analogy, but I can't find it. And I'm not gonna butcher it, but it's not a long article. It's very good, and it's it's available online, and check it out. Vanessa Wills, Spectre Journal, first
I will
issue.
include the link in the show notes.
Perfect. Yeah.
Okay, so in Recovering Anti-Racism, Reflections on Collectivity and Solidarity in Anti-Racist Organizing, Azfar, Shafi, and Ilyas Nagdee point out in their words, in popular or mainstream discourse, solidarity is increasingly being replaced by the framework of allyship, or as a transactional rather than a transformative relationship. Allyship reduces solidarity to a fragile politics of temporary togetherness between groups or struggles that will remain otherwise separate. It is predicated on a vertical relationship between partners, rather than the more generative horizontal process of building solidarity across difference. Meanwhile, the moves towards a transactional logic of solidarity transforms it into a mechanical, almost market-style exchange. I think this is really interesting, and I'd like to know what you think.
Do you want to go for a study, or?
Sure. Yeah, I also think it's really interesting. And I think, like, always there's the caveat of like labels and, what one person might mean by allyship might not be exactly what is meant there. But I do think what is being described there is a real phenomenon that is really described in an accurate way, and it's worth thinking about. And I guess it just reminds me of an experience I had when I won't get into the details of what the actual sort of activism organizing was, but the composition of who was involved with it was different people of different sort of broad racialized and class identities, maybe not so much class identities, but racialized identities. There's a combination of Indigenous people who were white, people who were, I don't remember if there were other Black people besides me. There were other people of color, people who experienced racism. And it was sort of like there was a sort of organizing around a kind of land defense against this sort of really egregious real estate developer in Winnipeg. And what ended up happening over a lengthy amount of time trying to push back against a certain development in a certain place, being vague here, but there was a lawsuit that happened. And then the lawsuit was this huge, stressful, more than 40 people named on a lawsuit. And now all the people who were involved with this direct action organizing against this real estate land development were put in a position where they had to decide how they were going to respond to this legal situation. And it was at this point that some of the ideas coming through in the quotation you read, David, really the different ideas of how to work together across these lines of difference really came to play. So one idea that unfortunately kind of became the dominant idea within that group was that anybody who's white should sort of foot the legal bill and be the front line of getting the brunt of any kind of potential problem that comes out of this sort of state clampdown in this legal battle in the aftermath of this direct action. And there wasn't really much discussion around what does it mean to be oppositional against the state? Is it as simple as a calculation of saying one person has a particular social location and therefore that's the whole way of describing how to navigate this sort of complex and very rigged against us situation? And yeah, that just seemed very reductive, very sort of, it's true that there are differences between people in different groups, of course. People experience oppressions in different ways. Some people don't experience particular kinds of oppression. The danger is in sort of being very unsophisticated in recognizing the complexity of where people are and undermining or erasing the possibility for a unity that's deeper than a sort of superficial, you're this, and therefore this is your place, and therefore the potential for working together only looks like this. So that was just a personal experience. I hope the vagueness doesn't make it impossible to decipher the point I'm trying to make here. And I just feel like it's always important when talking about things like this to not overcorrect and not sort of minimize the real differences people actually have, and different people are exposed to different risk and experience different kind of unfair situations that are based on broad oppressions. And that I think it's a mistake for maybe white listeners to think, see, we're all united, and whiteness doesn't really matter in these kinds of considerations. But I do think, like, who you're up against and what that means for what kind of ways people can work together are questions that aren't really easily answered simply by saying white people must do this in this scenario every single time. There's no sort of more complex ways to think about it. So that's what I'll say first comes to mind there. And yeah.
Sharmeen?
Yeah, thanks for that, Teddy. You give me a lot to think about because when I first started doing anti-oppression workshops, a big component of it on the requests, and I still get these requests about how to be an ally. And at first it seemed like, when I, gave the list, and they're hard, when you Google how to be an ally, you get a list. You get a list of like, don't say racist things. It's kind of ridiculous, actually. Don't say anything racist. Give your money to whoever you're supporting. Listen, all this kind of weird stuff that just seems kind of like more like intuitive if you're part of organizing. As I've actually like cut all that from my workshops now and talked about like what solidarity could look like, what relationship building could look like, and and like kind of like real issues I think activists face, right? Like working in anti-poverty groups that are really dominated by white people, even though statistically poverty impacts people of color at greater levels and with more disparity. In my union movement, in my own union, lack of involvement of people of color or indigenous people or women, like my local or my union, CUPE, is predominantly made up of women of color, yet the leadership is always white. And so I think people really need to contend with this. And I don't think that's about being a good ally, because when people say, oh, we're allies, it kind of takes the power relationship out of what's happening. And also I feel like when people take up that mantle of an ally, they're almost kind of taking over some movements. And the word ally really reminds me of, that letter that Martin Luther King wrote in Birmingham to like the white moderate. I don't have it memorized or anything, but he's talking about all these like white moderates who claim to be allies, but are like, we're with you to a certain level. But when you start like shutting down streets and like being too rowdy, that's when we can't support your movement. We only like it when you're nice. And I find that encompasses a lot of that definition or relationship of allyship, where it's like support to a certain level. That happens with Palestine, that happens with Indigenous solidarity, that happens with the BLM movement, right? Where allies are on side to a certain level. And then when it gets too radical or demands become too, extreme, that's when they kind of, pull away, and they kind of want this like politeness, I guess. So I find that a lot in like maneuvers being made by like major unions, major NGOs, especially when they wanted to be on side of the more radical uprisings that are happening in the grassroots. They're like, we want to support, but to a certain level. And so, yeah, I've been very not dismissive, but really trying to turn allyship kind of like inside out or upside down, to really ask people like, what would a relationship or a commitment to a movement look like if it meant that you were losing some of your own power and it was making you kind of uncomfortable, like what would that look like? I think that's really hard for people to answer because, people, we live in a world of scarcity and people want to hold on to what they want to hold on to. But I think that's a really important question about how much would you risk for a movement, Because I think people, when they're showing up and you have differences, that has to be a conversation about, if you're doing a demo, if you're, doing any kind of campaign, who's doing the riskier stuff. And for me, if you're going to be an ally, quote unquote, or in solidarity, it would be people with like, a lot more to lose to be on the front lines, right? Like not to say that's universally, right? But like we want to protect people who are undocumented. We want to protect people who are Black or people of color, Indigenous from police violence. I'm not going to make the assumption that if you're, led by white people, the cops won't go in, with batons or anything. But if it creates a scenario where they might pause, then, maybe that'd be an interesting tactic to experiment with, One thing also this quote reminds me of, and what you're talking about, Teddy, is the kind of, resurgence or popularity with Surge, which is standing up for racial justice, I think. and they're quite a huge group in Toronto. And it's interesting, like I've gone to a few of their meetings to talk about campaigns for them to support. But their main mandate is to like, really fight white supremacy and talk to white people and provide workshops about white supremacy. But what they're mostly known for practically is if you need money, you ask Surge, because they do these like amazing fundraising jobs, like at their meetings and before rallies and things like that, where they fundraise like tens of thousands of dollars with this idea being like white people have more money. Or maybe they're just good fundraisers, I don't know. But I just felt really uncomfortable by that assumption, like especially for wanting to engage like working class poor people, and the assumption is like they have to give money, and it becomes transactional. Then yeah, I think that's a really sad relationship to have, like, yeah. So I guess I would like, it just really depends. Like I use ally in like certain ways, like when I don't expect more from people. I'm talking to like major union heads and I'm like, you're an ally, like give us 10,000 or something. I might do that. But I do agree that it is predicated in something that's transactional, something that's superficial, that's for sure. And for me, at the end of the day, how I've seen real struggle being forged and real solidarity being forged is when people struggle together, when you're in the streets together, when you're organizing together. And I do think that there's a lot of difference, then you need to have that uncomfortable conversation. Like, for example, and, people who might own houses in Toronto and those who don't, those who are like precariously housed all the time. I think that needs to, be discussed about how we take care of each other in our own organizing. But I would never mean to extend that all white people are rich or something, or all white people have more to give. Yeah. So I definitely like to talk about power a lot in our organizing, but I think we should all aim for equality of treatment, equality of, raising power amongst everyone, things like that. And that kind of gets torn apart, especially when like the more crude identity politics comes out with who can speak on what, and for me, I actually don't have much criteria about that anymore. I used to, but I feel that if people can kind of show their commitment on the streets and everyday, in their everyday politics, then yeah, I actually don't mind if, there's a white guy who's going to be talking about anti-racism and white supremacy, in fact, I have built leadership with white people to do that, so yeah, that's where I kind of am with the allyship thing. And I actually don't know if it's being used that much anymore. I think it is more taken up by liberals now. But I have started showing that letter in my workshops, the one that Martin Luther King wrote about like the white moderate and how that's a dangerous place for liberals to be in, and how the white moderate actually can prevent so much movement by social movements, more than conservatives, more than racists. So yeah.
Yeah, I think regardless of the language used, I think that what Shafi and Nagdee are talking about when they talk about, the more difficult but generative process of building solidarity across difference, I think that there's a lot of skepticism, even on the radical left, about the possibility of doing that when that's a difference that's based on oppression, right? And I think that, which has got a lot to do with the low level of social struggle, which means people haven't had the experiences, for example, of being able to build solidarity across the lines that racism creates within the working class at a level that isn't just a very low level of unity. So I do think there's a real dilemma around these politics.
Yeah, I want to also say, and I mean, this might be really basic, but maybe it'll help me, get to something a little more better. And that's just, let me try to sketch out this thought process here. Like there's ways in which a transactional approach to life is becoming more life is just mapped onto this sort of transactional scheme in all kinds of ways, beyond the topic of anti-racism and how socialists should navigate to that, but just in general, even in friendships, etc. Like just transactions, market, this kind of a thing is sort of, what we're socialized in, what we see everywhere. And one function of the sort of transactional approach that I'm not even describing in a negative way, I'm just saying it does some sort of connection between like the individual and the aggregate or the collective. Like you have a transaction and you are there's something going on with you as an individual. So one's individual agency is part of that equation. And so the explanation goes, all these individuals sort of acting in their way and having their transaction is sort of somehow there's some leap to being a collective or something. That's going on in the transactional kind of framework. And allyship, again, when you think about it in a transactional way, even if you don't use that word, allyship, if you just think about one's particular identity as an entity as different from another, and that sort of being across different lines of oppression and some sort of cross talk or cross connection happening, it does fold in where one exists on the individual level. And it's on an individual level where there's inner things such as courage and sacrifice and stuff. There's these sort of things that are still important in, when you're talking about, Sharmeen, you're talking about this sort of idea of, we'll do, the white moderate or the liberal approach of, we'll support up to this point, and then when it becomes too much, whatever that line of too much is, that's the end of the support. I really think about how there's, you already talked about how there's not like an examination of like, what does it look like, to build solidarity when it becomes something that requires giving up something or giving up power, or having sort of the willingness to go to that next level. And when I think about how that actually happens, there is an individual dimension to that. That's not the whole explanation, but there's an individual dimension to that where, having more individual kind of internal fortitude and commitment and integrity is not the full explanation, but there's something going on there. And the nice thing about focusing on those internal components, not as a substitute to collective, but is we do have quite a bit of, control or say or navigate, something we can do there. Like your own individual existential framework is sort of something you have quite a bit that you can influence on. Again, not the full, we're still in a context and we don't lose sight of that, but there's something there. And so what I'm getting at when I'm trying to bridge this sort of individual to collective and, talk about this sort of the transactional piece is I do think there's something to be said about not forgoing that kind of individual work and that individual kind of necessity to build courage, to build integrity, and to not just approach it as something that only happens on the collective level. And unfortunately, like there's a whole bunch of views and theories that offer a very lousy set of ideas of how to explore and navigate that. And I think that the problem with, having insufficient kind of ways to think about that is you just give people bad tools and it won't help. It won't help. It'll lead more. It'll if you just leave it to a market transactional approach and as a way to deal with what you do on an individual level, then you lay the groundwork for the moderate approach, because where does your self-interest in the immediate end? And that's going to come up against when there's greater sacrifice and you end up, you no longer can frame it as a sort of gain for yourself or something like that. You have to lose too much. And that's way different than a framework of really having a principled, integrity-based, understanding that sacrifice is sometimes not just good, but necessary. And that's part of the whole thing. So I don't have it all figured out. I do know that it's work to really keep to be principled in what you do, because our society is not set up to prioritize what is right. It's prioritized for profit and to maintain certain power structures that are really damaging. So yeah, I feel like, again, I'm not really coming to a big conclusion here, but I just do notice that I think with the transactional kind of framework and the markety kind of framework to groups working across different oppressions, it does in a wrong way bridge the kind of individual to the collective. And if we can expand our idea of what solidarity even could be and can think about it in a way that isn't really offered by that view, I think you can work backwards and have a different view as well of what individuals can do. And that doesn't have to just collapse into a tit for tat exchange framework. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one thing I just want to conclude on is that there's a bit of a vacuum with how people can get involved. I mean, some groups can be are closed and or hard to get involved in, and sometimes people just I can only sign a petition, I can only donate, and I think as activists, we do need to create, or revolutionaries, we need to create different openings for people that isn't just like, oh, you want to get involved? Okay, let's do this blockade. Or let's confront the police as the first activity that someone does. And that is a struggle, right? To create different openings for people based on their comfort as a way for them to get experience and more confident. I mean, I struggle with that a lot, because I'm always trying to think strategically about big actions or something that's really unique. And I have to remember that especially because people leave, or we need people coming in, and then maybe a different place. And so I think definitely creating different opportunities of exposure and entrance is really important for revolutionaries to think about. But also I think we also need to really refuse that transactional, kind of relationship amongst ourselves. And I know David wrote an excellent article about, when revolutionaries get paid and sort of the more radical feminist realm, there's this fuck you, pay me attitude, which I agree, for a lot of things, when a lot of universities want things for free from activists in the movement. I'm no, you should be paying for that. But I think that has also really seeped into our movements too, right? Where I think we have to openly be against that. I will do workshops for free. I will do work for free. Not because it's transactional, but because I'm I'm committed to this revolutionary cause, and it's not going to be done by paid work. I'm not opposed to some people getting paid if they're going to be doing more work or we need it, but definitely social change and the revolution won't be happening by paid organizers or paid union organizers at all. But so I've been more open about it. I've been I'm a bookkeeper, and when activists or indigenous groups ask me for help, I'll do sliding scale, and I will make that clear to my politics because I work for a union, so I'm fine. But I don't think a lot of people do that, and I think it's something. I think we've kind of stopped talking about the wage relationship, or I don't know, more basic basic Marxist tenets. I think we've kind of ignored that now. But I think we should bring it back and really remove it, remove that transactional attitude from our practice, because it is really limiting us. It's why rather than seeing thousands of people in the street, we just have thousands of people donating to orgs like BLM, which is great. Now they can do more organizing, but I would rather have those people be trained and show up when we need them, So yeah, but definitely I think this idea of wage being paid and transaction is very much seeped into our movements, and it is really limiting, So now people feel that the only way that they can get anything done is by paying someone, and it's just untenable.
So in a very different direction now, I guess, to what we've just been talking about, I want to just note that something that I've seen, I think, as a significant political change in recent years has been the spread in anti-racist milieu of ideas that are influenced in one way or another by the academic school of thought that gets known as Afro-Pessimism. And according to Afro-Pessimism, modern society is really founded on violence against Black people. And I'm going to quote from another article in the journal Spectre, Nick Mitchell. They're writing, and he says, in terms of trying to explain Afro-Pessimism to readers, talks about how for Afro-Pessimism, what it means to be human is constituted by, dependent on, and committed to anti-Black violence. And writing in the UK, Annie Olaloku-Teriba notes two political themes that she thinks reflect the influence of Afro-Pessimism. One is the idea of anti-Blackness, the idea that it's an exceptional form of oppression that's distinguished from what other non-white people experience. And then another is the charge that gets raised against people who would be called non-Black people of color when they attempt to draw comparisons between Black struggles and their own, and the allegation that that's engaging in anti-Blackness when people try to draw that comparison. So I'm interested in what your take is on these kinds of ideas.
Okay, so before I answer that, I want to just point out, let everybody know that David sent us the questions in advance. And so I mentioned Spectre, and then the next question David brings up Spectre. I feel like I'm stealing the careful laid out system here. So I just think that's funny, but I also want to admit that. For Afro-Pessimism, I'm not an expert on it. I reflected on this question, and there's a few things I'll say. One, it's got a cool name. I think the name is really incredible. But I want to just mention what I think some things that it gets right that are worth not losing in the criticism. And one of those things is, I remember someone once said this to me when I was learning about some anti-racist theory in a much younger place in my life. The question of, it's not, is it racist? It's the question of, how is this racist? Which was really, really eye-opening to me, to think about things in a way that I hadn't thought about before. I don't believe that anymore. You can't just find the shadow of racism in every single thing. At the same time, racism extends to everything. So figuring out the balance, like when you're socialized to really turn away from acknowledging or thinking about racism, and then having a wedge in that breaks open that matches some experiences you've had and also gives you a theoretical framework, is really helpful. Now, that's not what Afro-Pessimism is, but that sort of giving legitimacy to the psychic experience of Blackness and the racism one experiences, I think is a really good thing to pull out of that and to keep with that. It extends the sensitivity to how deep anti-Black racism is, how pervasive it is. And I think that is very much based on the creation of Blackness as a category. It is very much based on the particular material history of North America and the Western world and the capitalist world. I think those things are very, very important to note. And I want to just harp on this a bit more by saying that I just think one of the things about racism in particular is that it is really, there's a problem with mystifying it, but it's really one of those things that can be so different than someone's experience who doesn't have it, like so different. Like at every point where you might try to say, I get it, I relate it, you could be getting it wrong. It's like it's a complex thing, and I think I'm always open to more more connections and more bringing that forward, the idea that it's that big and that deep. But I do think that there are problems with some of how I understand Afro-Pessimism to be, and one of those ones that was mentioned that already the person was it. Let's see, Nick Mitchell already raised in the article, was just that when you have a theory that is sort of disconnected from social struggle, and it sort of exists as a theory, and then it's used to describe things, but it's not actually connected to social struggle. It's not actually connected to and refined through social struggle. It's going to have distortions, and I think it's a fine hypothesis, but you got to go ahead and see, like, does this actually match up? You can come up with theories about anything. So does the ideas of Afro-Pessimism and the idea that essentially that, like, there's no possibility of being in this society as a non-Black person that is, besides being categorically against, that is just part of the problem against Blackness, is okay, that's a claim. All right. Does that actually play out? And what are the answers when you think about people who are in the fringes, who are in the mixtures, who are in betweens? And I also wonder about how Blackness beyond North America gets theorized within Afro-Pessimism. So, but I'm a first generation African immigrant. I came as a baby, so I don't have the same background as the person who's Black and who's been on Turtle Island for many more generations directly through the slave trade. So I feel like I should mention that because, people should be free to criticize what I'm saying too.
Yeah, I did some reading about Afro-Pessimism as in a reading group on Fanon, and so Afro-Pessimism is a I don't know if it's influenced him directly, but is part of the conversation. When and Fanon, who really talks about the psychology and the consciousness of racism and what is it to be human. It is a huge thread to that theory. And I'm in a current reading class with Theodore Allen's book on Invention of the White Race, and a lot of these questions about Afro-Pessimism is coming up because of his kind of politics or ideas about how race and whiteness are constructed, and while there are mechanisms for some people who weren't white to become white, would it ever be a possibility for Black people? And what does that mean for categories of race if race is totally meaningless, and whiteness can invite many people who aren't white, but the main race that's been left out from that has been Black people. And it's a huge debate in the reading group, and I'm really appreciating it. I recommend people reading that book as well. It's really challenging, and it really challenges how you've been thinking about racism, especially in liberal capitalism. But to answer some of the questions, because it does come up, right? There's this kind of narrative around stay in your lane. You can't, even with this recent stuff with the Oscars and Will Smith, a lot of things on Twitter being like, if you're not Black, you can't comment on what happened between these two celebrities, and a lot of comments like that, or politics like that. And I will say that and I'm speaking just from my background, I'm South Asian, Pakistani, and Muslim. And so I grew up, with, and I've left that religion, but the role of Black Muslims have always been elevated, in my life. And when I went to mosque, people often talked about how Black Muslims have experienced a lot of racism in the Muslim community, and that was against God. And if I can take any appreciation from that time, it is that, people loved Malcolm X and his return to, Sunni Islam, and so it was kind of I learned from a very young age that experiences of Black Muslims were very different from other people around the world, that they were not seen as real Muslims, that often Black Muslims are treated badly as servants in Saudi Arabia towards Arabs. And I began to articulate my understanding of racism around how close you are to whiteness. So yeah, of course, for Irish people or Scottish people or Italians, the closer you're to whiteness, the more you can be included in the club, later on, depending on how protective you are in capitalism. And then I think for other immigrants in Canada, the lighter you are, I think does kind of have a direct correlation with how easily you can get access to the privileges of whiteness. Doesn't mean maybe full entry into the club, but it is a way, again, to my example before, you compare yourself to other people. Well, at least I'm not like that community or Indigenous community, and for me, that's around the closest to whiteness. I don't think it's simple, like a direct correlation, but I do think it is part of the narrative that's fed into us about how the operationalization of racism and anti-Blackness in Canada, for sure. And I have definitely seen the struggles of non-Black people of color compare themselves to Black people, and I reject that. I mean, I know that people's well, atrocity happened to other people, et cetera, et cetera. We can't minimize the incredible disruption of the African slave trade that we're still living with right now, in terms of our world economy, the formation of the colonies, the formation of Canada, everything that was so central to it. And it's not to say that no other forms of oppression have happened, but it is formative to where we are right now. And I'd also say the same, though, as that, because a lot of people of color, and I did this as well, compare especially in the settler colonial state, compare the struggles between Indigenous people. And I say that we would have to reject that we really need to understand the specific forms of relationships that have created for us in order. And it's not to like preserve these categories. For me, like my end goal is like that, like my idea of no racism is what Fanon's ideal was, right? That these categories become meaningless to us, and that maybe they operate in like, minimal ways. But in terms of the structural ways, those are gone, yeah, like he didn't talk about some sort of like Black nationalism to, as a specific space, but as a way to destroy racism, to destroy those racial categories. And that's my goal. And so for me, to destroy racial categories, we have to talk about the specific histories, especially of the African slave trade and also of settler colonialism here in Canada. It's just necessary. And I think the kind of strive or the goal to like, compare is more of the multiculturalism, as a symptom of multiculturalism, that we all have equal oppressions, so we can all like deal with it, equally. And so I reject that. But just like Teddy, I'm not like I haven't studied too much about Afro-Pessimism, but I have seen a way to sharpen analysis in some ways. But I also have found it kind of leading me into like maybe more like postmodernism, like where there is no strategy of liberation. That it is like, that there is no way for there to be solidarity, because anti-Blackness just exists, and that's I agree that anti-Blackness may always exist, but I can't swallow that there is no way for there to be solidarity, or a way for us to like dismantle capitalism and white supremacy. That is a hard thing for me to accept. And so that's where I'm kind of like, that's where I have like a lot of questions about, how it can inform our practice of liberation and not just have us be like, nope, there's just like nothing we can do, so yeah.
Okay, then to move towards wrapping up, I guess I want to just throw out the question about whether you think there are particular kinds of activity that are worth prioritizing today in this, so-called Canada, for advancing anti-racism, based on your assessment of this political conjuncture that we're in. This is the question I was stuck on when I got your questions in advance, David, because I find like the general socialist anti-racist movement to be quite weak right now. Socialism generally is quite weak right now, but like I've been really feeling this with the trucker convoy. Like there was no anti-racist response or uprising, or it was really small, I was kind of like, I participated in some rallies in Toronto, and I thought for sure there'd be like thousands and thousands of people just like totally outraged, about this like really reactionary politics now just like taking over, the streets of Ottawa, and just like, getting so much media coverage. And I'm like, okay, so like, what does this mean for, the anti-racist socialist left, that we didn't respond? Were we unprepared? Did we think it would just go away in a few days? But even so, like, I don't know why we weren't there right away, to like provide an anti-racist working class analysis to people. Instead, kind of let those truckers run wild and just get all the support, and they took up the mantle of working class politics during that time, So I've been feeling a bit down about that. And like I know there's going to be there's like actually a meeting today happening in Montreal talking about there's a national meeting of some kind, and I'm involved in an event with Midnight Sun and others on like the trucker convoy and how we can understand it. It's just like, I don't know, it feels absent. I don't know how you two feel. So, like it's hard for me to understand like what activity to prioritize when things seem so weak. I would say like we definitely need to work on grounding our analysis in anti-racism and in socialism, and like, just even amongst ourselves, just internally,
understanding what that means, especially in context of what happened last month. And it seems to be like it's gone away, but I'm sure they're growing somewhere. Somewhere they're like meeting, and I think we need to be more prepared. And then, in terms of like other activity to prioritize, I just think we need to be more public in our anti-racism. So if we're not educating people in our groups already, then to be holding more events, holding more protests, and to make more public our analysis. That our politics is a framework of liberation for everyone. It's not to divide anyone. It's not to say someone's better or not. But the real liberation comes with democratic and socialist way of working and living amongst each other, and that is one where people will work less. It's like this is what you'll get. You'll work less. You don't have to work more. You'll work less, and I think like we just have to be more in the streets about that. Like I don't want to fetishize rallies or anything, but it is the most public way. And if we're struggling together, we will build solidarity together. If we have fights together for an action or for a campaign, that is what will fight racism for me. If I can be on the streets with like a white comrade, or that is where the theoretical becomes actual struggle. So yeah, but I've been struggling with this because I've been so sad about and it's not. I've been trying to have conversations with people, and I don't know. There's a lot of fear about what happened with the trucker convoy, and just like the kind of white supremacy they manifested. There's also been a lot of dismissal about like, oh well, it was just like a fluke and it's not going to happen again. So I've been really like, there was a big reckoning for me, and just seeing the absence of that. So yeah,
I think that this is something that from a Winnipeg context, like there were so many people who were at the Black Lives Matter rally a few years ago. It was incredible. And I know for a fact that internally to the organizing that happened there, I wasn't part of that organizing, so I don't want to make it sound like I was in that, but I know that there were these key debates and discussions that we were talking about through this entire episode about how to balance appealing to a lot of people, how to make your demands and how to shape those, how to think about how your tactics fit into that, who gets invited, what is the sort of like idea of what's liberation for the sort of organizing that they were doing. And I just think that it would have been incredible if some of that sort of energy and that sort of organizing was also pointed towards responding to the trucker convoy with an explicitly anti-racist angle. And what would it take for that sort of a thing to happen? I think it's very possible for that to happen. Like just in the same way that the trucker convoy organizing has retreated to the invisibilities of the internet or wherever it is right now, it's still happening somewhere back there. There's a lot of background organizing around the Black Lives Matter rally in Winnipeg, and that those connections have not disappeared. Those connections are ongoing. That's still happening. I think if there isn't that sort of relationship between socialists in general and that kind of organizing, then there's less of an ability to contribute to those kinds of pivotal discussions and decisions when the time comes, which is not to say that socialists have all the answers and there's no socialists involved there. And so rein in on your white horse and save, or not at all. But socialists who are involved in thinking about socialism and thinking about these questions have something to contribute to that. But you can't without a relationship. And so those relationships, and the other thing too is as huge as that Black Lives Matter rally in Winnipeg was, don't be overwhelmed by the size of that to think that there's no room to contribute by having some really good relationships, organizing relationships, credibility there. Don't think that, oh no, 5 people who are involved in the long haul kind of organizing wouldn't have made a difference. Very much could have made a difference. It's not, there's an outsized outcome, by having people with good ideas connecting with other people and making things happen. It's not like I know that we're weak on the left, and socialists and revolutionary socialists are weak, but we're not so weak that we can be zero impactful. So there has to be sort of like a confidence that could happen. But just to reiterate and connect to the point you've made a few times, Sharmeen, like the relationships are crucial. And so you don't know what kind of political and organizing relationship from today will be the one that is going to help in the future. So you just kind of got to always be doing that. So there's that kind of idea. And I do think that would have, the outcome and the way that the trucker convoy went down sort of reveals where we're at, just as you mentioned. And also, I hope reveals an opportunity when I connect it to other amazing organizing that has happened in Winnipeg, in spite of our extreme need for even more. The other idea that I just want to add to this question of what's worth prioritizing and any kind of activities, like just thinking about anti-racism and what we should do, what should we do? That question is just, it can't be stated enough. Don't leave this work to employers or liberals or capitalists to take the lead on anti-racism work. It's incredible how that is just sort of it already frames things in a position in a way that is not great, and it takes a big task, and in my opinion, it makes it even more difficult. There's a lot of anti-oppression work that needs to be done, and as I mentioned earlier, if it doesn't get edited out, all of it could be useful in a way. Like, we do have to prioritize, but we can't just because you're not necessarily organizing towards a specific rally, or just because you're not organizing towards a specific response to something in the moment, doesn't mean that broader kind of educating, that broader kind of I'll just say in quotes, in general, anti-racism organizing is not useful, is not good, is not going to be helpful, is not strengthening. So I just think like we're all so taxed that it's difficult to do everything. It's impossible to do everything. But we find ourselves in a situation where it's helpful for capitalism to take on its own kind of superficial and liberal anti-racism education campaigns and strategies. And we have to be attentive to how that's an obstacle in certain ways, and how we're not on the same team when that work is happening that way. And it's not like it's doing some of the work we need to do. It's not doing the work we need. We will still need to do that work. And unfortunately, it might even make our work doubly difficult, because in some ways it can make the racism we have to respond to even more invisible or not on the radar. And then that's not helpful either. So, yeah.
In terms of priorities, is I actually have found a lot of like around the different prison abolition and defunding the police campaigns, a lot of really rich conversation and debates about tactics and anti-racism, and those movements I feel have really elevated conversations about carceral state systems and anti-racism. And for our work known as legal, we want to include border services in that with CBSA. Like we want to. They are violent institutions that really focus on communities of color and make like rip apart families, destroy people's lives. And I have found though that there hasn't really been much strong articulation from a socialist perspective around abolition. And I think that's work that socialists could also do, is like really articulate why, abolition is part of our socialist, politics, and why we're also fighting for abolition of the police and prisons. Also given like how past socialist and communist states have, or past and also current so-called social states use those mechanisms as well. So so I am excited about that. There's going to be an abolition convergence, and I really hope a lot of socialists participate in those conversations.
Thank you so much. I think it was great. lots of really great stuff in this episode. So really appreciate it. That's it for this episode of Victor's Children. I'd like to thank Jonathan Croker, the producer of Victor's Children, without whom the podcast wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to thank Posey Legg, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. If you found the episode worth listening to, please do tell other people about the show, since word-of-mouth recommendations are especially helpful. If you don't subscribe through your preferred podcast app, please do. And while you're there, please give the show a high rating. It helps to promote us. If you have a suggestion for an episode or some other kind of constructive feedback, feel free to be in touch with me. You can contact me through victorschildren@gmail.com.